Hello, everyone. First, let me say that I sincerely regret not being with you in Bangkok for the 16th International Conference on Sustainable Development, presented by the Ontario International Development Association uh, in conjunction with the International Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Law and the Center for Research in Social Justice and Policy at Laurentian University. We're very proud with this partnership with Ontario International. However, we've met many of you at some of our previous conferences, and I sincerely regret not being there to meet with you again. For those of you that I have not met previously, I truly miss the pleasure of getting to know you in Bangkok. My name is Henri Pallard. I'm the director of the International Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Law. I'm a professor at Laurentian University, Sudbury, Ontario. And this presentation that I'm doing today is based on research that we have done with Dr. Carol Kelpie, who is a principal director of the Homelessness Project and a professor in School of Social Work at Laurentian University, and the director of the Center for Research in Social Justice and Policy. This research has also benefited from a substantial grant of $1 million from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. I will be speaking to you today about a human rights approach to homeless encampments in the city of Greater Sudbury, Canada. There has been in Canada over the last several years a rise in so-called tent cities populated by homeless people. Almost every city has seen these encampments, and many of them in the center of town. In my city, Sudbury, a homeless encampment set itself up across the street from City Hall in a park, and approximately 100 people were living there over the winter. Local governments have faced pressure to close down these encampments. In this paper, my colleague, Dr. Carol Kelpie, and I want to examine some of the factors that led to this rise in homeless encampments. I will then take a human rights lens to examine how we should deal with these homeless encampments. Now, homelessness is an obstacle to sustainable development, and the homelessness touches upon several of the Sustainable Development Goals set out by the United Nations. Goal 1, to end poverty in all its forms. Goal 2, to end hunger, achieve food security, improve nutrition. Goal 3, to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being across all ages. Goal 10, to reduce inequality within and among countries. Goal 11, to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Goal 16, to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, to provide access to justice for all, and to build effective, accountable, inclusive institutions at all levels of government and society. Rising homelessness in Western developed countries is an indication of policy failure, particularly of neoliberalism and its free market approach to housing. So how do we know about the extent of the problem of homelessness? How do we know about the impact that it has on sustainable development? How should this knowledge inform, how should homelessness inform a human rights approach to homelessness? How should our knowledge, and how does our knowledge Where does our knowledge come from? And very simply, our knowledge about homelessness comes from counting or enumerating homeless persons. And there are two fundamental ways of counting homeless people. One is a point-in-time method, and the other is the prevalence count method, called a PIT and a PPC, respectively. The PIT is conducted at a limited number of locations, such as shelters, and by doing a scan of public places. And it's normally conducted over a 24-hour period. It's point prevalence. It's a single point in time. The period prevalence count is conducted at all service agencies in the community, such as shelters, food banks, soup kitchens, agencies serving poor and homeless people. It's conducted over a 1-week period. That is why we call it a period prevalence. It's conducted over a length of time. And the data is collected to ensure an unduplicated count, to get a true count of homeless people. There is, among our group of researchers, a preference to do period prevalence counts, as we know now that they are more effective in northern, rural, and remote communities such as ours, where hidden homeless is a dominant form of homelessness. Now, one of the differences in these, or several of the differences between these two methods of enumeration, the point in time and the period prevalence count, comes into their completeness. The point in time count is not intended to be comprehensive, yet it's the most frequently used method, and that is for reasons of cost largely. It is used in both urban and rural places in Canada. But it has been shown that there are difficulties in using a point-in-time count in rural and northern communities because it does not capture the full range and the completeness of the homeless community. Period prevalence count captures more of the homeless population because it targets a greater range of locations, and it's done over a greater range of time. And it has been found to be more effective in northern, rural, and remote communities. So if we were to compare the results of a PPC and a PIT in Sudbury, and we did one of these counts in 2018 through the Center for Research in Social Justice and Policy at Laurentian University. And we did a point-in-time study on day 1, and then we extended it into a period prevalence count from days 2 to day 8. And so our period prevalence count runs from day 1 to day 8 over an 8-day period. And I'm just going to take one result to show you the difference that in results that is yielded between a point-in-time count and a period prevalence count. We're now looking at the count of Indigenous and non-Indigenous in a point in time and a period prevalence count. If we look at the Indigenous population, it's been undercounted by 5% in the point in time, and it's actually 20% greater in the period prevalence count. That 5% represents 20% of the total of the Indigenous population. Now, when we keep in mind that the Indigenous population is 5% of the total population of Canada, that number becomes significant. And we will come back to this because as we work through the presentation, because one of the lead motives of this presentation is the Indigenous population of Canada, the effect of strategies to deal with it, and its effect on the Indigenous population, and how we should engage with it. So if we look at the point in time versus the period prevalence count in Sudbury in 2018, the total homeless people that were identified by the point in time was 711 people. However, the period prevalence count identified almost 2,200 people. That is 2/3 more than the point in time count. The point in time count only captures 1/3 of the homeless population. And this is not simply something that was discovered in Sudbury. We found the same type of information when we did a period prevalence count and a point in time count comparative study in Timmins, Ontario in the same year in 2018. So when we look at participation in a point in time and a period prevalence count, we can see how that effect occurs over time. On day one, there is a 30% participation. On day two, which would be day one of our, or day two of our period prevalence count, because if we take day one, we add it to our period prevalence count, it's 20%, 15% on day three, 10% on day four. These numbers from the PPC day one until PPC day four through to day 7 are numbers that are not captured by a point in time. Now, what are some of the detriments of the point in time? Well, at risk of homelessness is not taken into account. There's a high risk of becoming homeless among a certain group of the population, and that is not identified by a point in time count. Secondly, another large group of people, the hidden homeless who are actually homeless but are not visible, are not taken into account. And this hidden homelessness population suffers the same deleterious health outcomes as those who are absolutely homelessness. This leads to policies to remedy homelessness that are framed on incomplete data. Programs are designed and implemented, and they are not targeting the proper groups, such as women, who constitute a substantial number of the homeless population, single parents, youths, or in this particular case, Indigenous people. There are benefits to an incomplete count, because a lower count means that governments will have to spend less money, and consequently, we will have lower program costs. The lower numbers also gives the illusion of progress, which is not actually occurring on the ground. So what is homelessness? There are different types of homelessness, and we have absolute homelessness, hidden homelessness, and at risk of homelessness. Absolute homelessness are those people who do not have a place that they consider to be theirs, or a place where they sleep regularly. Hidden homelessness is a category or subcategory of absolutely homeless, but the person does not appear to be absolutely homeless. They don't have a place that they can call their own, and they do not sleep at the same place regularly. Hidden homelessness people. Then we have a category of people who are at risk of homelessness, and they are pending eviction. They have extremely low income and consequently at risk of not being able to pay the rent and being evicted. They are people suffering from familial abuse, either spousal or as a child. They have an inability to pay the rent. They have existing medical conditions with no benefits. All situations would lead them to be in a situation of not being able to pay the rent and consequently of finding themselves without shelter. Now, I briefly spoke about hidden or concealed homelessness, which is a form of absolute homelessness. And these are people who live in a precarious situation and often move between forms of homelessness from at risk to absolute. And we found in our studies that hidden homelessness or concealed homelessness is a primary form of homelessness in rural and northern communities in Northern Ontario, Canada. Now, there are many types of this hidden or concealed homelessness. There's couch surfing, that is, sleeping on the couch at one person's place one night and on the couch of a different person's place for the next 2 nights, and then somebody else's place the following night. Moving from couch to couch. Hidden homelessness, they do not appear to be on the street of being absolutely homeless because they're in somebody's home. So these people rely on informal, familial, or social networks to provide them with a place to sleep. People living in substandard or overcrowded housing are part of the hidden homelessness group. People living in tents, in bush camps, out in the forest, outside of the city, or in recreational or camping vehicles that are not meant for regular accommodation are part of the hidden homelessness group. People living in motels or hotels or in temporary accommodations or in institutional settings are also part of the hidden homelessness group. People engaging and exchanging sex for temporary accommodation are also deemed to be part of the hidden homelessness group. And these are categories of people that are not caught by a point-in-time count. But they are largely captured, we think, by our period prevalence count. And here, this is a picture from one of our photo voice projects of somebody that we've given them a camera and they've taken a picture of where they are sleeping. And we can see the iconic Hudson's Bay of Canada blanket in the back. When we look at our 2018 PPC enumeration results, we see the breakdown in these categories of homelessness. Absolutely homeless are 581 people, or 26.7% of the total. And the numbers in parentheses that you see there are those who are under 17, and they're included in the gross number of 581. Hidden homelessness are 734, 33 people under 18. Now, at risk of homelessness, 863, or 174 under 18. So when we look at these numbers, if we only do a point-in-time count, we will only identify approximately a quarter of we will identify less than half of the absolutely homeless population. We will miss out all on the absolutely homeless. And we will identify none of the at-risk population. And so in the end, we've only identified a quarter of the population. What is particularly striking in this is that almost 20 years ago, in 2000, we had only identified 400 individuals with various forms of homelessness. We are talking about a 5-fold increase in homelessness. Now, there will be certain reasons for this increase, which I'll come to in a few moments. So when we look at percentage experienced types of homelessness by linguistic or cultural groups, and the important one that I want to concentrate on for the purposes of this presentation is the indigenous group. What we see is that the indigenous, who constitute 5% of the population of Canada, and maybe 9%, 7 to 8% of the homeless population, of the population in Sudbury, constitute 40% of the absolute population, of absolutely homeless population. They constitute 50% of the hidden homeless population and 35% of the at-risk population. So Indigenous groups are largely overrepresented in the homeless population. They constitute 5% of the population of Canada, 9%, 9.5% of the population of Sudbury. And so they're overrepresented by at least a factor of 4 in the homeless population in Sudbury. And when we look at this again, we see that Indigenous people are not the largest group living in absolute homelessness, but they're the second largest group. They are the largest group living with hidden homelessness. And they also make up 1/3 of the at-risk of homelessness group. When we move to questions of gender now, we find that women constitute approximately 1/3 of the homeless group, and men 2/3. People who identify as two-spirit, trans woman, trans man, gender queer, represent about 5% of the participants. And that's significant because, again, the people who don't identify as male or female are overrepresented in the homeless population, which signifies that they are facing particular challenges in their everyday lives and integrating into society at large. 14% of our population identified as LGBTQS2S, significantly larger than the population at large. So what are some of the reasons that we have for this increase in homelessness? Well, we've been conducting these studies for more than 20 years. And one of the things that has occurred is better methodology. Over the years, we have been able to build up enhanced community partnerships with social service agencies. Also, the province has now mandated enumerations of homeless people. So social service agencies now have to participate in these counts. We also have more willing partners in social service agencies and in the community, and a greater acceptance of the count and of its beneficial effects for services and for remedying the issues related to homelessness and counting homeless people. We've also expanded our studies over a wider geographic area. We've expanded from, originally we concentrated on the downtown area where the homeless people were concentrated, and we've moved out into the suburbs. And we found that there were substantial numbers of homeless people out there, to the surprise of many people. We also have to talk about an increase in homelessness. There has just been a general increase in the homeless population over the 20 years that we've been doing these studies. So homelessness in the city of Sudbury has increased over the last 20 years, but that is not something that is particular to the city of Sudbury. That is, homelessness has been increasing nationally, provincially, and in many local communities and in my community here of Sudbury. One of the particular manifestations of this increase in homelessness has been the rise of homeless encampments, or at least they have become more visible. And a homeless encampment is a place where homeless people will gather together in tents or other temporary structures and live there. Now, these are homeless or informal settlements. We can have tent cities. They're often in parks or in the woods around the city. We can find them in groups living under bridges or under overpasses. We can find them in subway tunnels, on sidewalks in certain areas. We can find homeless encampments of groups of people living in dilapidated or abandoned buildings. The rise of encampments is the rise of encampment is not a new phenomenon, we think, but it is a more visible phenomenon. Previously, homeless encampments were hidden from public view. They were in wooded areas, they were outside the margins of visibility of traditional society. These homeless encampments, have now set themselves up over the last few years in very public areas. In Sudbury, the homeless encampment of some 30 or 40 tents set itself up in a park across the street from City Hall. Very, very visible. This high visibility of homelessness through these homeless encampments is a troubling reminder of the housing crisis in our country, the high cost of housing and the lack of housing. And Leilani Farha says that there's a pervasive lack of affordable, permanent housing in our communities. This is a picture of the homeless encampment here in Sudbury, right across the street from City Hall. And the matching tents are explained by the donation of some generous people who gathered some funds and got some tents to make sure that the people have adequate shelter rather than a tarp or a piece of plastic. And during the winter of 2021, 2022, there were at least 90 people who lived in the tent encampment in downtown Sudbury. Now, why do these encampments spring up in downtown areas? Well, they're located in close proximity to the goods and services that homeless people require. So goods and shelter, social services, public transportation, and friends and acquaintances also. And there is greater safety outdoors during the COVID-19 epidemic. We have to remember that the rise in these tent encampments occurred during COVID-19. And there was a large negative reaction to these encampments that occurred in most major cities in Canada, from small to large, from Sudbury to Toronto and Vancouver. It was just a visible form of homelessness in many of our communities. Governments came under pressure from citizens to clear out the homeless encampments. Governments did clear them out, most often without taking into account the human rights of people. Now, why was there such a problem with the rise of these encampments? And one of the reasons that we feel was the rise of COVID. COVID led to a reluctance of homeless people to spend their nights in shelters where they would have to be in close proximity to one another. Public health authorities were advising people to stay outdoors if one would be in direct contact with others. So if you're going to be with other people, you were better off outdoors. And so there was a reluctance among the homeless people to go indoors at night into the shelters. The shelters were perceived to be a risk factor among the homeless population for getting COVID. In response to this, the city leased motel rooms to house the homeless population at night. However, the homeless people were bused to the motel in the evening, and then they were bused back downtown in the morning. So they were in a close proximity to other people. And on top of that, they could not stay in their motel room during the day. They had to leave the motel room during the day. So people did not want to be bused back and forth, and buses were seen as a risk factor for COVID. Given the pressure that local governments were facing to shut down, to clear out these these visible homeless encampments, because as long as they were invisible and people didn't see them, there was no pressure on governments. Leilena Farha and Caitlin Schwan wrote a report for protocols for dealing with homeless encampments in Canada. And this was a pretty significant report because Leilena Farha is a former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing, and she was a Special Rapporteur from 2014 to 2020. So her report carried some weight. And the protocol was written in reaction to government moves to clear out encampments. And she formulated 8 key principles. 1, recognize that residents of homeless encampments are right holders. And so we have to move away from, we have to have a shift from criminalizing, penalizing, or obstructing encampments. And we have to adopt an approach that's rooted in rights-based participation and accountability of the power, local power structures, local governments, and also of rights-based participation of homeless people. The engagement of homeless people must be meaningful, and we must look to in their effective participation in policies and programs and practices that affect them, and also in strategies to dismantle the homeless encampments. We have to move away from forced evictions of encampments, and we must, because they are a gross violation of human rights. The 4th principle was to explore viable alternatives to eviction before the local governments engage in a strategy of forcibly moving out homeless people from their encampments is to look at other means of addressing that situation. And that would require engaging the residents of the encampments in discussions about the future of the encampment and how government could address it. And the governments must also ensure that relocation of people in these homeless encampments is human rights compliant. And to recognize a principle that the right to remain in one's home and community is central to the right of housing. And just because one is homeless does not mean that one does not have a right to remain where one is, and also the right to maintain relationships to that community. Must ensure that encampments meet basic needs of residents consistent with human rights. Compliance with international human rights law is fundamental to dealing with homeless people and their encampments. Principle 7, to ensure that human rights-based goals and outcomes are consistent with human rights laws. We must further human rights of the inhabitants and ensure their dignity, and doing all of this within compliance with human rights laws. We must also respect, protect, and fulfill the distinct rights of Indigenous peoples in all engagements with encampments. So Indigenous people have a set of distinct rights. And this has been captured in UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This was adopted by the General Assembly on 13 September 2007. 143 states voted in favor, 4 states voted against, of which Canada was one. It's interesting to note that the 4 states that voted against it, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States, all have substantial Indigenous populations, are all countries populated through colonization. Finally, in 2021, some 14 years later, the government of Canada adopted UNDRIP, but with very serious reservations. Article 21 of UNDRIP provides that Indigenous peoples have the right, without discrimination, to improvement of their economic and social conditions, including housing. And that becomes particularly significant when we are addressing homelessness populations, because as we have seen, the Indigenous population only constitutes 10% of the population of 5% of the population of Canada, 10% of the population of Sudbury, yet constitutes 35% of the homelessness population. So the right to housing becomes very important in that context and fundamental to dealing with Indigenous people. So also, Indigenous people have the right to participate in decision-making matters that would affect them and to be represented by leaders that they themselves have chosen. That means that when we're dealing with homeless encampments and where Indigenous people are present, that we have that added obligation to ensure that we consult with them and that they participate in the decision-making through their own chosen leadership. Encampments reach particular problems for human rights. Farhan Schwan point out that adequate housing is a human right according to the United Nations. And as would flow from that is a prohibition of forced eviction of homeless persons from encampments, argued Farhan Schwan. And any relocation must be compliant with human rights, including adequate housing. And under the adequate housing rubric, they would argue that there are 7 standards that local governments must meet to supporting encampments in order for local governments to comply with their obligations to respect the human rights of homeless persons, safe and clean drinking water, hygiene and sanitation facilities, i.e. toilets and showers, resources and support to ensure fire safety so that tents do not burn down, waste management systems, facilities and resources that will support food safety, that will support harm reduction, and also rodent and pest prevention. Basic requirements for an area that will offer a modicum of safety and healthy living when in a homeless situation and in an encampment. Local governments have engaged in policies of forced closure of encampments. That is a policy that is largely unsuccessful because once the homeless people have been forced out of their encampment, they will simply go and set up elsewhere. And so the encampments emerge in other locations. Normally, they will, well, often they will emerge in less visible locations, and so they will be subject to less pressure. However, they will be less accessible to services that are needed by these homeless people. Moreover, we have to remember that for UNDRIP prohibits the forced relocation of Indigenous people, so that there's a particular obligation for Canada to deal with Indigenous people who are in homeless encampments according to the principles of UNDRIP. In setting up strategies to deal with homeless encampments, authorities must consult with people who have had lived experience of homelessness. And the residents of these homeless encampments would identify their representatives in decision-making. They have a legal right to participate in decision-making. And the City of Greater Sudbury's official plan recognizes that citizen engagement as a requirement in community decision-making. And it's a guiding principle and a determinant of a healthy community. So, and community stakeholder groups must be involved in the decision-making process, in particular with regards to homeless people. Farha and Schwann's argument sets itself off against the classical conception of human rights, where the primacy of the individual and the protection of human liberty are fundamental to the notion of human rights. What we see in Farha and Schwann is an agreement, is an argument to make human rights more social based. And so human rights are in a period of transition. Human rights laws do not recognize a right to housing. It's a serious cost to government to provide housing to its population. And in a liberal capitalist economy, it's something that governments are quite happy to leave to individuals and to fend for themselves. So the cost is a serious obstacle and impediment to the recognition of housing as a human right in a liberal capitalist economy. So homelessness and encampments in the middle of cities come as a challenge to classical conceptions of human rights. Yet housing is a fundamental condition to the enjoyment of freedom and autonomy, to the enjoyment of the classical human rights. So we are at an intersection between homelessness and the denial of human rights. It creates and homelessness creates and reinforces a process of social distancing. It rests on the exclusion and marginalization of homeless individuals. Human rights legislation, on the one hand, clearly prohibits discrimination, but our codes do not forbid discrimination based on social condition, such as the absence of housing. So that is my presentation, and that sets out how the clash, if we want, at the end of the day, between the right to housing and the challenge that it poses to dealing with encampments, and also the particular problem that we have in dealing with Indigenous peoples who are in homeless encampments under UNDRIP. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me.